bus. I don't know if it matters.
It's like photographing and organizing. You know, this lens.
All right, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. My name is Pietro Smarco. I'm the education coordinator at VIVO Media Arts Center, which is a Vancouver-based nonprofit artist-run center that directly supports the creation, production, education, exhibition, distribution, appreciation of media works by independent artists and alternative community-based producers and activists. The center also houses the Krista Dahl Media Library and Archive, which is Western Canada's largest archive of experimental video and film works. Today's talk is part of a series of activities we've coordinated around the topic of e-waste, obsolescence, and cultural memory. If this talk intrigues you, you should check out the youth mentorship project, in which 10 artists are repurposing a discarded electronic organ, and also check out the free walking tours of e-waste handling facilities that take place next week. There's more info at the door. This evening's event takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As a privileged guest on this land, it's my hope that the work I do through VIVO provides opportunities to learn how the everyday use of media technologies shape our historically formed relations to each other and this land. Studying the management of electronic waste in relation to these various uses of land and the cultural, political consequences of e-waste management might encourage us to begin or continue questioning these relations. The talk is co-presented by VIVO Media Arts Center, SFU's School of Communication, Free Geek Vancouver, SFU's Institute for the Humanities, and SFU's Faculty of Communication, Art, and Technology, who also provided this room. Extra special thanks to Stuart Points, who's a professor in SFU Communication, and he's also my ex-thesis supervisor, for his continued guidance and generosity in helping me set up this event. Josh Lepawsky is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland. He researches the geographies of modern waste, which he describes as those wastes that are synthetic, heterogeneous, and which entail high degrees of uncertainty around their mitigation and remediation. 2 case studies inform his work: the international trade and traffic of discarded electronics, that's e-waste, and much more recently, off-world rubbish, which he defines as the remains and discards of human extraterrestrial activity, so activities in space, outer space. More about his work can be found at his blog, Reassembling Rubbish. His book, Reassembling Rubbish and Worlding Electronic Waste, we read a chapter from it at VIVO last night, and it was really a joy to read it with you. It's tentatively set to come out in the spring, so look out for it. Please welcome Josh.
Well, thanks very much for everyone being here today, and special thanks to Pietro and everyone involved who's been helping to organize the events that have been ongoing. This is the second event for me today, so it's been very high energy, and I'm still kind of pumped from the previous one, so hopefully that carries over to this evening. Let me just, before I really jump in, just say a word about the word worlding in my title there. So when I say worlding, what I'm talking about are practices that gather together sets of not necessarily like things: electronic products, corporations, citizens, consumers, wastes, toxicity, and treats them as if they all inhabit the same common world. And the reason that idea is going to be important as the talk moves along is that part of the argument that I'd like to make is that if we're genuinely going to deal with electronic waste in ways that might actually reduce it or mitigate it, we need to world otherwise. We need to re-world or do worlds of e-waste differently. So to help start telling that kind of story, I need to start about 17 years ago when a technology journalist named Russ Ahrensman published an article in a now defunct trade magazine called Electronic Business. And in that article in 2000, he talked about something called electronic waste. The article is largely a profile of a new initiative, or then a new initiative between Hewlett-Packard, the electronics OEM, original equipment manufacturer, and Sims Recycling, who had, both of those organizations had facilities located in Rosevale, California, which you see circled on the map there. Sorry, it's a bit hard to read. And the partnership that HP and Sims got into together saw the gathering of electronics from HP products at the Sims facility, where it went through some processing and was then trucked 5,000 kilometers to the Horn smelter in Rouyn-Noranda, Quebec for final processing and smelting. And what the green circle there around the Sims and HP facility indicates is a radius of 500 kilometers. And what's important about that is that some studies done in Europe have suggested that after 500 kilometers of road transportation, the benefits of recycling electronics are gone because you've put more CO2 into the atmosphere through road transport than you have recouped or saved through recycling. So here you have this program showing us a kind of an interesting geography that saw electronics being trucked roughly 5,000 kilometers across the continent to one of the few smelters in the world that can handle electronics as an input, as a feedstock. And unless you know anything about metallurgy, of which I know not very much, but in sort of following these trails, it turns out that there's only a handful of such smelters on the planet that can handle electronics as a feedstock. Smelters are not kind of just giant furnaces into which you can chuck anything. They are very highly tuned to the materials that go into them. So Canada actually hosts 3 of the maybe half a dozen or slightly more smelters in the world. Horn, Belledune on Chaleur Bay, and Trail, of course, in BC is which you may know about. Now, other studies of the Horn smelter, that specific smelter, documented that specific smelter, in the same year it was receiving material from the HP program, released 90,000 tons of sulfur dioxide, 620 tons of particulates, 80 tons of lead, and 2.2 tons of cadmium, very toxic heavy metal. And the effects of those could be traced, beyond the immediate site of the smelter. So, they're airborne kinds of discards. And the reason that I need to start telling the story this way is that it is important to, I think, defamiliarize ourselves, not just with sort of preconceived notions of what electronic waste is, where it comes from, who deals with it, under what conditions, but also defamiliarize or make strange again what we think we know about waste. And the reason for that is that we all probably have a very intimate and personal relationship with waste. Even in this room, we're probably only at best a few meters from a waste bin. And so when we think of waste, that's, I would argue, often what we have in mind. It's what I put in the bin. That's waste. And yet, when you start looking at waste more broadly, the vast majority of waste is what's occurring in the dark gray and the red, in industrial waste, and then some special waste, and depending on which jurisdiction you're in, what counts as special waste, it changes. But in other words, something like 98% of overall waste generated happens before we even buy product X. Which means if we're talking about the waste that we put in the bin, whether it's trash or garbage, or the waste we put in for recycling, we're talking about the 3% slice. So I borrow quite heavily from my colleague Max Libéron, who it's a real privilege to work with. I I can't stress how great she is. But she's pointed out that the way a problem is framed is really important, because that framing then makes certain ways of dealing with the problem thinkable and at least potentially actionable. While at the same time, that problem framing not just takes other ways of handling the problem off the table, but even can make them unimaginable. So if we are concerned about dealing with waste more generally, or even electronic waste, if we're talking about household recycling or individual recycling, we are already consenting to dealing with that small 3% slice. We will be doing nothing to deal with waste that happened before we even purchased our devices. So that's one reason it's very important, I think, to make this defamiliarizing move, this making strange again when we're talking about waste. Another concept that I work with today and in my research on electronic waste is this notion of indeterminacy and waste. So as Brian Wynn, a science and technology studies scholar, points out in a book on hazardous waste and risk assessment that hazards and waste are fundamentally ambiguous. Their intrinsic physical meaning is not given and objectively predetermined in nature. In other words, there's nothing in the material that you're talking about that inherently makes it either hazardous or waste. It becomes a tangle of human ideas and the material consequences or effects of the materials at hand. One way to illustrate that is to look at to contrast how the UK and the US regulate the same chemical as a hazardous waste product or item, polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. In the US, PCBs or materials with a PCB concentration of 50 parts per million are permissible to be landfilled. But in the UK, it can only be 10 parts per million. It's exactly the same material, and yet they differ by a factor of 5, right? So there's nothing inherent in the materials itself, as it were, in nature, that is defining the hazardousness. And so waste, and hazardous waste in particular, is a fundamentally indeterminate phenomena. What that means in a more concrete sense is that unlike uncertainty, which you might be able to quantify, we know that a phenomena can occur in this knowable range from X to Y. We might not know where in that range, but we know there's, as it were, a ground floor and a top floor. Indeterminacy is different. You don't even know if there is a top and a ground floor, if that makes sense. Now that might seem somewhat abstract, but it works out in how electronic waste or discarded electronics get labeled. So in the 70s, the US Bureau of Mines started doing studies about how what it called electronic scrap might be mined for precious metals and semi-precious metals. The term was electronic scrap, not electronic waste. There was no concern in those reports about what might be happening to it if it wasn't mined. They didn't care if they weren't worried if it was going to landfill or what. But then in 2002, just after Ahrensman's article in Electronic Business, an environmental NGO called the Basel Action Network started talking about something called electronic waste. And now, the very same things that 30-odd years earlier had been electronic scrap and a potential source of resources were a hazardous substance and a waste object. Now, of course, those two sort of realities are not mutually exclusive. Even today, we can see kind of a mixture of treating discarded electronics often as waste, but sometimes people are thinking about them as a potential resource. I'm simply pointing out that the same underlying thing has two different worldings around it at different points in time and from different groups. So it's there is a fundamental sort of ontological indeterminacy to the thing itself. I also need to draw on this notion of non-coherence, or I think I do when I'm talking about electronic waste. Non-coherence, again, comes out of some science and technology studies literature. The conceptual distinction is non-coherence is not the same thing as incoherence. Incoherence is sort of fundamentally not knowable. Non-coherence is different in that, at least in principle, you can know something even if it does not occur in any kind of regular patterning, I guess. And the way I might illustrate that notion is, so these are some graphics from a paper I published a few years ago that examined the new laws that had been being passed in Canada and in US specifically to handle electronics take-back from consumers. And so there's a couple of things to notice. One is that not every jurisdiction had such laws, which is what the map is showing. It's just presence or absence of laws that had actually been passed. And so if you were standing literally on one side of the border, the thing in your hand, the laptop, was not electronic waste, it was something else. For me in St. John's in Newfoundland, it would count as something called bulk garbage and would go to landfill, whereas if I was in BC, it would be taken and recycled in an electronics facility. This graphic here just takes, the columns represent different categories of electronics that each of the laws talked about as covering. And if it's blacked out, it means the law explicitly stated it covered this set of objects. If it's gray, it meant that the law was ambiguous. It might cover, it might not. And if it's white, then the law in question explicitly excluded those objects. And as you can see, it's a patchwork, right? The same underlying objects are not the same from place to place. So we need to talk, or I need to talk about non-coherence when it comes to understanding e-waste as a thing. We might use the pronoun it to talk about e-waste, but corralling the it, into a singularity is this kind of mixed bag of worldings. Okay, so that's a little bit maybe a heavy conceptual work right at the beginning. So I'm gonna, in the next section, I'm gonna move into some work I've done to try and chart flows of electronic waste around the world. Yes, which looks like a crazy spaghetti diagram. So to set this up, what I did was, keeping in mind the concepts of indeterminacy, non-coherence, and defamiliarization, I did, in a way, stumble across a data set available from the United Nations Comtrade database. There is a data category for waste batteries and electric accumulators. And it's the only international trade category that I could find that relates to electronics in any direct way. And I gathered that data up, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, but then started mapping it out in terms of how it's traded from territory to territory. So to think through some of the importance of working with the concepts of indeterminacy and non-coherence before getting into the mapping itself, you may have heard of the Basel Convention on the international transboundary trade of hazardous waste. Arguably, it's probably the most important piece of international law that attempts to regulate international flows of hazardous waste, of which electronic waste is one category. It covers many other categories as well. But what I wanted to highlight here is two pieces of the convention itself, two annexes to the convention. Annex 8, which gives you called List A, a set of materials that will be covered as hazardous waste under the convention. And then Annex 9, called List B, which is what will be considered non-wastes and as a consequence not governed by the convention. And what I've highlighted, I'm sure it's too small to read, but what I've highlighted here in yellow are several categories of things that are electronics. So non-waste contains electronics, and waste contains electronics. So electronics is both and. It is both waste and non-waste under the convention. So again, corralling something into a coherent category called electronic waste, it is a worlding in the sense of bringing together a set of practices of not necessarily like things. I also need to talk a little bit about how the Basel Convention works. So on the right-hand side of the screen there, all of the countries in blue have signed and ratified the Basel Convention. People love to point at the US and go, oh, the US hasn't ratified. The US has signed but not ratified the convention. There's a variety of reasons for that. We can probably put those to the side for now, but if anyone's interested, I can speak to that at the end. But then the Basel Convention has a provision in it called Annex 7, sorry for the technicalities here, which essentially divides this world up into two monolithic blocks. One block includes the EC, the European Community, or now the EU, Liechtenstein, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And the convention says it's fine if you guys trade waste, including hazardous waste, amongst yourselves. And then there's the other monolithic block, which is everybody else. And this says it's fine if you trade amongst yourselves. But it is not okay to send waste from Annex 7 countries to non-Annex 7 countries. The convention doesn't even imagine that it might go the other way. And this is interesting because it speaks very much to how waste is imagined as a sort of world problem. As we'll see in a moment. Okay, so when I took that data from the Comtrade database, I just categorized every country that had data for it into whether it was an Annex 7 state or a non-Annex 7 state, and then started looking at where the flows go. And what's very, well, at least initially very interesting is that the dark bar there is electronic waste moving from Annex 7, or we could say maybe the developed world or global north, to non-Annex 7, or so-called developing countries or global south. And early on, quite a bit was moving in the way that the Basel Convention says it shouldn't. But over time, that flow has dropped dramatically. On the other hand, flows from non-Annex 7, so the global south or developing countries, to the global north, to Annex 7, have been increasing. That does not at all match well with the dominant way that e-waste storylines are framed. And so one's confronted with how to reconcile some of this, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Looking at that same data, just now in using some colors and some flowiness, along the bottom here you've got years from 1996 to 2012 at the end. And what we see is that since 1996, flows of e-waste from Annex 7 or developed countries have been declining. That's that sort of brownish line that cuts across the graph. At the same time, especially now, the vast majority of e-waste flows is occurring between Annex 7 or developed countries themselves. I would argue that part of the reason for that is that it's in those countries where that sort of handful of smelters that can handle electronics exist. Canada has 3 of them, Japan has 1, Germany, and I think Germany, Belgium, and I think Sweden is the other. So that's part of the story going on there. And in terms of the dominant way of being worried about e-waste, that e-waste is something that is being dumped from the developed world, as it were, to the developing world, it turns out that, at least when you consider these data, you're talking about 1% of total trade, the way the dominant storyline is framing e-waste as a problem. which again really jars badly with how e-waste as a matter of concern is usually framed. Okay, so what I then did was use these data to create a cartogram. Basically, this is essentially a social network of waste flows, where the nodes, instead of being people, are countries, and the lines connecting them, instead of being knowledge or information, is a material flow of waste. The colors refer to the continent that a particular country is part of. The flow lines are proportionate to the underlying volume of flow, and you read them in a clockwise direction. I know that is probably a bit hard to see, but one easy one that is able to be picked out is the USA, sort of in the top right-hand section there, and there's a very large flow going to Mexico. In fact, Mexico receives about 99% of e-waste from the United States. This is significant to think about because both the US and Mexico are OECD countries. So whatever you might think about whether that's fair or right or just, it's legal under the Basel Convention. That doesn't make it okay. It simply is not a trade that is in violation of international law. So again, that is some empirical evidence that we might need to think about or rethink what we think we know about e-waste if we're going to deal with it as a problem. So if anyone is interested in sort of following this up, I've made this available on the website that's going to accompany the book. And it's an interactive website that allows you to click on any country that's included in the data set, and you'll be able to see its trade network. Over here on the side, you get a list, you get a little bit of extra information. So I just clicked on the US. It's telling me it's part of the OECD. It's an Annex 7 country. And then underneath it, you get the connections that it has with other jurisdictions. If they're mutual, that means the US and that country both send and receive e-waste from one another. If they're incoming, that means the US is receiving from that list of countries. And if they're outgoing, that means those countries are receiving from the US. And this really highlights the role there that Mexico is playing as a recipient of US electronic waste. Again, we may disagree about whether that is a fair or just flow of electronic waste, but it's not violating international law. They're both OECD countries. Of course, China plays very big in the discourse around electronic waste. And partly what's interesting to me from this data is that the way China is typically narrated, its role is always as recipient. And yet what these data show is that there's actually quite a bit leaving China as well to other jurisdictions. So again, quite a different picture of e-waste than the typical storyline would suggest. What am I highlighting here? Right, the role of jurisdictions like Hong Kong, which have kind of special administrative regulations around them. Hong Kong is, of course, the special administrative region. It doesn't have a designation under the Basel Convention, which means it can act as this kind of important conduit that is, in a certain sense, outside the rules of the convention. So there's that aspect of it. And also, Hong Kong is a very interesting jurisdiction because it's very wealthy, has a higher per capita income than both Canada and the United States. Lots of people in Hong Kong able to afford the newest electronics, and they get then exported from Hong Kong to other jurisdictions within the region. So where they're sent for reuse and the like. Another aspect of this data that's worth highlighting, Africa. of course not a country but a continent, Africa is always narrated as the recipient, and usually the recipient of e-waste dumping. But what these data show is that it's actually it does receive electronic waste, different countries in Africa, certainly, but Africa is also a major source of electronic waste. You see it moving out of Africa to Asia. In this case, India is an important recipient. There is a smelter, there is a smelter in India that may be part of the explanation for that. Also, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, is a very important destination of flows of e-waste from Africa, from elsewhere in Asia, as well as the Americas. So, we don't really hear about South Korea as a major area of concern when it comes to e-waste dumping. If you've been looking at e-waste, you have almost certainly stumbled across Agbogbloshie, the site, almost infamous site in Ghana. And you can certainly find electronic waste at that site. But what these data show, and then some of my own research, as well as research that some of my graduate students have done, show that domestic consumption of electronic equipment in Ghana itself is a very important part of the picture, something that doesn't really get talked about. In a way, it's indicative of our lingering geographic imaginaries of the world, right? It really shouldn't shock us that the capital city of Ghana, Accra, has hospitals, banks, law firms, universities, all of which have been using electronics for decades. And this is a photo I took more or less in the center of Agbogbloshie, this infamous scrapyard or waste site. And carved into the top of that desktop there is the acronym GIMPA. That's the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration. So in other words, domestic consumption and discard in these zones that have been construed only as recipients of the developed world's or the global north's e-waste. Domestic consumption is a very important part of the picture in terms of generating waste. But also, even as a site ostensibly only about waste, there's much more going on here than just dealing with waste. In trying to come to grips with those quantitative data, the quantitative trade data that I was taking you through a moment ago, when I was doing field work, I kept bumping into, and keep bumping into, I'm still doing field work, all of these instances where just outside what would be framed as dealing with waste is a whole vast, sort of ecology of business of refurbishment, repair, reuse. And in this image here, these two guys are building computers from scratch. You can see some of the power units in the background there, the fans, that you can see the circle, that's a fan. That's all, the words here are slippery, scavenged, collected from domestic consumers in Accra, and refurbished, repaired, reassembled. This is right in the center of Agbogbloshie, this site that is over and over again framed as a toxic waste dump, which is not to deny that there isn't that going on, but it's a very partial version of the picture. And I would point out that these guys are building full computers from components that have been picked out of the discard stream domestically and building custom computers. You can tell them, I want so much memory, such and such RAM, this kind of monitor. Now, I don't know how to do that, right? These guys don't have any formal education. How many in the room would be able to assemble their own computer out of, not random, but scrap parts? I'm just curious. Okay, so yeah, 1, 2, I couldn't. So it really plays, again, with our notions of waste and vulnerability, you know, formal and informal, educated, non-educated, all this kind of stuff in ways that are, I think, very important to think through carefully. Another example of this, and I can't help every time I give a presentation like this telling this story, the first paper I ever published on the e-waste trade came out in the Canadian Geographer, and I got the proofs for the article that was all premised on the quantitative trade data. I got the proofs while I was doing field work in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And the editors wanted the proofs back in like 2 days. So I had to run down to a copy shop where they pulled my article up on the screen on this is a Philips 107T monitor. Those were first manufactured in 2000. So I was there in 2009. It's possible, though I don't know, that that monitor was already 9 years old at that point. At least double the lifespan typically assumed for use in Canada, US, Western Europe. And so I was kind of giddy at the moment seeing, my research playing out in real time. And I didn't think to ask, where did you get the monitor? Did it come from an auction from, the domestic market? Or was it imported? Did you bring it in from overseas? So I don't know. So it's one photograph and thus an anecdote, but it's also telling. Our stories around e-waste are, again, they're typically framed as waste as a sort of end-of-the-line moment, right? This is the death of our products. You often see storylines around e-waste about where electronics go to die, right? So this is the end. But another aspect that I just had to confront from a straight-up empirical sense of doing fieldwork was, in this example in Dhaka, Bangladesh, this is a shop that repairs and refurbishes printers and monitors, but they also, I suppose, recycle them. I suppose recycling is the word. And not in terribly sophisticated ways. Heft it over your head, bang it on the street, and it busts open. You get access to the metals, the circuit boards, the plastics. But what I'd point out here is this is the same person here smashing it who's now on the hand phone. He is now calling the dealer who's going to buy the plastics from this shop after it's bundled up, and the metals and the circuit boards, which when you follow their trajectory through the city, that's high-grade copper from the wiring in electronics. This is a heat sink, so it's very high-quality aluminum. When you start to, this is another reason that electronics are such an at least for me, an interesting thing to follow in terms of a discarded object, because once it comes apart, the pathways just ramify. You've got plastics going this way, you've got aluminum going that way, you've got copper going that way, and it's impossible as an individual to follow all of that. So I'm very lucky to work with grad students who also engage in that kind of following the thing. In this particular case, we can just follow the plastics trail a little bit further. And it went maybe 50 meters down the road to a little micro enterprise where they're taking the plastics, putting them through a shredder, chipping it, washing it, chipping it, and extruding it in noodles, and then chipping it into I suppose technically they're called nurdles, which you see here in the bin. And those plastic nurdles are then taken to another business next door, totally separate, and put into a hot plastic press to make CD and DVD cases to sell the pirated movies, exported to India, to Singapore, to China. So when we were doing this research, part of what was surprising, at least at the time, was doing research on e-waste. I was expecting to wind up at the so-called end of the global economy, and yet I found myself right in the middle of it. And I had to sort of completely reorient how I was thinking about discarded electronics and e-waste. None of that is to suggest that toxic hazards, remainders, and all of that don't happen, but that's also, to leave it at that is a very partial version of the story. And if one is genuinely concerned about mitigating waste from electronics, as we'll see in a few minutes, I would argue you have to look much, much further upstream, long before you and I even purchase our devices. But I'll get into that in a few minutes. More of our research now in Lima, Peru, where we've been investigating. It's now so obvious to me how the role of repair, reuse, refurbishment is in driving this economy of electronic discards that I've had to not really switch tacks, but really start to focus in on global economies of repair and reuse. This is Alicia. She's been repairing CRT televisions for the last 17 years. When we interviewed her, you can't see, it's too small to see, but there's a manufacturer's sticker on the back there. This particular monitor, she's not tearing it apart to get at the materials, she's actually putting it back together. It was manufactured in 1995 in Tijuana, Mexico. So there, you're starting to get in now to sort of global south-south flows. You're getting, that's a 20-year lifespan, keeping that electronic item in use. So one of my colleagues and I have been starting to try and quantify what I will, because I'm not an engineer, he is, I will loosely call the environmental offsets of repair. So what has been conserved by keeping these materials in use, as opposed to what goes into manufacturing a new device. And just almost as a tangent or an aside, one of the reasons that there is such a demand for what we might think of as e-waste here, or discarded electronics, is that the quality of manufacture of electronic items for our markets is much higher than for less wealthy, poorer markets overseas. And so that's part of it. There's a demand for that high quality yet very, very cheap, even free electronics, right? We get rid of them. You bring that to a different country and you can resell that for, tens of dollars that you've gotten for free. So it's a huge profit margin, right? That's part of it. Another part of it is that, especially when it comes to CRTs, even though CRTs have now, for the most part, the manufacturing of them has ceased as we've switched to flat screens, there's still a huge demand for CRTs outside of US, Canada, Western Europe, because this older equipment is much more robust in terms of handling fluctuations in the electricity grid. And so it can handle blackouts, it can handle, a very kind of surging, reducing power load, whereas newer devices tend to burn out much more quickly. And so even though it's very old and very used, the demand for it is there because it continues to work, much more so than newer electronics. Okay. So sort of with all of that, it struck me as there's an overarching need to sort of look again at how we tell stories about electronic waste, but look again in a different way. And again, to sort of illustrate some of the reasons why, I'm going to focus in particular on a report that came out of the Basel Action Network, this environmental NGO, but not because I'm interested in critiquing their work, more because that one particular report from them has gone on to have such a career in framing the e-waste story by other people. So it's not so much about how the report itself as how other people have used that report. And sort of to try and back up my claim there, I'd point out that this one particular report, for example, moved out of the report itself directly into U.S. legislative debates that were going on in 2009 and actually continue on to this very day. The law that is being talked about here never passed, but it keeps sort of coming back in new iterations of Congress. What I would point out is some of the text from the bill and what I've highlighted there in blue. So early on in this text of the hearing related to this law, there is an attribution of a particular statistic to the Basel Action Network that approximately 80% of e-waste is directed to recycling in the US is not recycled, but is instead exported. That 80% figure, or the range 50 to 80% export, has gone on to circulate all over the place. You see it cited over and over again in academic literature. You see it cited on what I'll call the wild web. You see it cited in media reportage. And only sometimes is it actually attributed back to the original source. So part of what I've been interested in doing is tracing the career of this number as it became accepted as a fact, and try to think through what is it about that report that made it so trustworthy. You know, those of us in academia will be very familiar with citation chain analysis, I suspect. This is just data from Scopus, where I just looked at who has cited exporting harm. And it's quite interesting because exporting harm, it's not a peer-reviewed article, yet it's among the top 10 most highly cited documents in any of all of the academic literature that has electronic waste or e-waste in its title, abstract, or keywords. There's something, 2,800 such articles, at least that Scopus finds. And so this peer-reviewed report gets cited at least within the top 6 of that, often in what Scopus calls environmental science, and indeed in the journal Environmental Technology and Science. So what I did to start thinking about the role of this figure was take the titles, abstracts, and keywords of all of those articles that cited the exporting harm report and pulled them into a piece of software that you can use to do text mining with. It's free, open source, scholarly kind of thing, and looked at the most frequently occurring words. Sorry, it's a bit hard to read, but within this corpus of text, the titles, abstracts, and keywords, it's about 63,000 words in total, roughly the length of the book that I wrote about this. And looking for all of the word variants for recycling, so recycled, recycling, recyclates, etc., versus anything upstream, like design, like manufacturing, like producer responsibility, clean production. Recycling occurs, or some variant of recycle occurs over 400 times, which is 10 times more than any of those other more upstream ways of dealing with electronic waste. So what this tells me is that academics ourselves have started construing or worlding electronic waste in a very partial and particular way as a post-consumption discard problem, as opposed to anything to do with mining, manufacturing, design, etc. Which means whether we're cognizant of it or not, we are framing the problem in a particular way. And that means we are framing it so that we're focused on that 3% of the problem, right? Which is very telling. I also wanted to look at the trajectory, or the trajectory of that report as it occurs on what I'll call the wild web. That's a little bit harder to do. Except, as you may know, now with Google image search, you can do what Google calls a reverse image search. And you can drag and drop an image, and Google, when you set it up properly, it will return all of the pages on which that image appears, or all of the pages it can find on which that image appears. So I did that, very cognizant that Google is not the web is not the internet is not society, and if we need any reminder of that, you know, this is a cartogram showing where content on Google is largely produced in the US. Of course, there's a linguistic element that it's, you know, mostly Anglophone. So we must be careful about presuming that, you know, the online world is society, but some of the literature that I'm drawing on for this part of the analysis is starting to make the argument that configured in certain ways, you can use Google as a research instrument of the social, as opposed to researching the social online. So in other words, Google results can be an index of broader social patterns and social change. You need to think about how Google works in terms of algorithms. My apologies if there may be some of you in the room who are far more technically minded than me. Algorithms, though, I like to remind myself, is just a fancy word for rules. The rules may be very complicated, as the image is meant to suggest, and Google's algorithms are proprietary, so you and I can't know them, so there's all kinds of indeterminacy there. But the principles by which those algorithms work are accessible to those outside of Google itself, at least in general terms. And the way Google's results work is through a proprietary mix of the number of links that a website is receiving, the popularity of the site based on tracking user clicks on it, the freshness, in other words, some measure of how frequently the web page is being renewed or updated, how long the web page has been present on the web. That equals what Google is calling relevance and gives the results the page rank. So the one at the top is, through this proprietary process, deemed to be most relevant. So I'm cutting pretty fast and loose through some pretty technical stuff there, so we can talk more about that later. Anyway, so I took a screenshot of that cover image on the report and did the Google reverse image search. Here are the results in May of 2016, probably too small or blurry to read, but Google says there were 392 pages on which that image occurred. But what I want to draw our attention to first is something else which, when I first recognized what it was quite amazing. So that image, of course, like any photograph, is taken at a specific instant in time at a specific location. But look at what happens with Google's algorithms. It tells me Google's best guess for this image is e-waste developing countries. And this comes from BAN's report, Basel Action Network's report, and you can find the image on their Flickr page, and it says they call it migrant child from Hunan province sitting on one of the uncountable piles of trash in 2001. So what is telling here is a couple of things. One, that this very specific image gets put into this vastly larger category of e-waste developing countries that is resulting, right, from how users are interacting with Google's algorithms. In other words, this is matching, as it were, preconceived notions of what this image what boxes it fits in as categories. That's one part of it. The other thing that's important to notice is what is not returned, and yet in principle could be. I didn't get results like child in yellow sweater, grasses tall green, right? So the absence of those results is telling us in an indexical way what broader social or cultural patterns, right, that this image is resonating with. So Google is now becoming, used this way, a kind of instrument of research, social research with the web. So just like I did with the academic literature that cited exporting harm, I then took the first 100 non-duplicate but also working URLs from the Google reverse image search results. And I took each of those URLs and scraped the text from them, the non-HTML text, the plain language English text from them, and dropped that into Voyant. And the results are very similar. You see again, recycling is the dominant way that those pages are talking about the problem of e-waste, and those pages are the ones that have that image on it. References to design, so there were, this was a corpus of, I think, 123,000 words. Any variant of recycling occurs over 800 times, but anything upstream, design, manufacturing, repair, producer responsibility, clean production, occurs hardly at all. So yet again, a very particular, very partial way of framing the problem is being manufactured. Okay, so that made me think a little bit about the image politics, as some or many of you in the room may be familiar with, that people like Kevin DeLuca have talked about, and the use of what really Greenpeace pioneered as mind bombs, right? These images that create singular moments that, as Kevin DeLuca says, they are about flagging media attention and generating publicity, but they're also about, they're crystallized philosophical fragments, mind bombs that work to expand the universe of thinkable thoughts. The reason I think this is important to think with is how, in quite a contrary, even opposite way, that image and exporting harm, the report, has come to create a universe of thinkable thoughts. It's almost entirely about recycling, even though that report itself says recycling is not the answer. We need to, I mean, it's part of it, but we need to be talking about, in its own words, clean production and design. And yet the public conversation in academia and the public conversation on the wild web is almost exclusively constrained to recycling, which means we're consenting to have a conversation almost only about what to do with waste after it's already made, after it's already there. Okay, so the next little bit I want to talk about is to provide at least some of the evidence about why I think it's important to get beyond the storyline of e-waste being a post-consumer discard problem. And so I'm going to talk about what I call weighty geographies. And I mean weighty in kind of a double sense of literally weighing a lot, as well as sort of morally weighty in terms of the effects that we see. The reason I think this is important is that there's still really a pervasive tendency to be talking about online, the internet, the web, as a placeless, virtual, dematerialized, purely electronic, as if it has no kind of material connection to the actual world. And just to start illustrating that, just a recent piece from the New York Times on Bitcoin mining, it's almost, you see this discourse internally contradictory within it. So Bitcoin, this is text sort of screenshotted right from the article. So Bitcoin believers say it will be the currency of the future, purely electronic. But then the whole rest of the article is about how this particular city in Inner Mongolia, Dalad Baner, has become this major center of Bitcoin mining. And you know, I only vaguely understand what Bitcoin is and how it works, but in essence, it's a very complicated mathematical formula made deliberately complicated so that it is computationally expensive to solve it. You need a lot of computing power to solve it. Solve the problem, you get a coin, you create a Bitcoin. If you want to mine a lot of Bitcoin, you need to run a lot of computers. And what you see there are essentially server farms in Dalad Baner, China. And you think, okay, so Dalad Baner, China, Inner Mongolia, why on earth is it located there? Cheap coal, huge subsidies for electricity that had originally been about powering industry, But when the industry failed to locate, or it wasn't enough, or the global economy went through its downturn, Dalad Banner turns to Bitcoin mining. They have tons of cheap labor, tons of cheap electricity, and they can run these computers 24/7. Electricity has to be produced somewhere, somehow. In this case, it's coal. So this ostensibly purely electronic entity is directly related to mining coal resources and, of course, all of the discards that come from using coal to generate electricity, particulates, smog, CO2, etc. Okay, so this is the Lavender Pit, part of the Copper Queen Mine Complex near Bisbee, Arizona, where I've done some of my field work. Between 1975 and 2003, the US electronic and electrical manufacturing sector was annually consuming the amount of copper that came out of that pit over its entire roughly 40-year life cycle. So every year, somewhere a hole of approximately those dimensions was being dug in order to feed just electronics manufacturing within the United States. And indeed, it's memorialized. The Lavender Pit is not a working mine anymore, but there's a plaque just off the highway right next to it. Now, ironically, the Lavender Pit itself more or less closed in 1975, but 1975 is also marked as a year for which the demand for copper suddenly went back up again. Why? The demand for personal computers. This is what the Lavender Pit looks like from space. So that dark patch in the middle there is that sort of lake you were looking at in the mine. This is the town of Bisbee. And just sort of a few facts and figures about the Lavender Pit. So it was in operation from 1950 to 1974. About 600,000 tons of copper were pulled out. And to get that 600,000 tons of copper, that generated 256 million tons of waste, giving it what miners call a strip ratio of 1 to 426. So every ton of copper meant 426 tons of waste. That might sound absolutely extraordinary, but it is totally normal within the mining industry to have a strip ratio where 98% of the weight, 98% of the weight of material coming out is waste, not the stuff you're actually after. So then, just a little bit further south of the Lavender Pit in northern Mexico, I was doing some field work with a very small electronics repair and recycling cooperative. And this whole region is very tightly tied to the global economy of copper. So just south of here are a couple of different copper smelters, which are not, we're not receiving material from the Lavender Pit, but receive it from other nearby mines. The Cananea mine, maybe you've heard of, is very nearby. So to put electronic waste as a post-consumer discard problem in some perspective, a United Nations initiative called the Solve the E-Waste Problem publishes statistics of countries around the world and how much e-waste, post-consumer e-waste they generate. Mexico in 2014, they estimated at 958,000 tons. The one single smelter just south of the Lavender Pit produced 986,000 tons of sulfuric acid waste. So this is a number for a whole country. This is a number for a single smelter in that country, right? So now I hope it's starting to become clear about why I think it's so important to push the conversation about electronic waste upstream. In the US, I don't mean to sound like I'm picking on BAN, but they've done, the Basel Action Network, but they've done another recent kind of media event where they put GPS trackers in devices. And they estimate that about 440,000 tons of e-waste that starts in the US is then exported from the US. Well, you compare it to that same smelter in northern Mexico, And that single smelter is putting out almost double the amount of waste in the form of sulfuric acid waste as the entire United States is said to be exporting electronic waste in a given year. So we need to be thinking upstream. Other ways of looking at why upstream matters, production matters. I won't spend tons of time on these graphs, but as you may know, more and more companies are publishing annual reports, electronics companies, that give some measure of the environmental footprint of their products, and CO2 equivalent has become the metric of choice across almost all original equipment manufacturers. The specific thing they're measuring, CO2 equivalent, we can sort of set that aside for the point I want to make here. What the bars are showing is where in the life of that electronic is that CO2 equivalent release happening. And the bright yellow is production. The gray part is when you're actually using it. The orange is when the device is being transported from manufacturing to market. And then the blue is released during recycling. So when we're talking about a range of models of phones that I could find data for from companies' own reports, in the majority of cases, at least half of the CO2 releases are occurring before we even buy the device. No amount of post-consumer recycling is going to recoup what was already released before we buy it. The same pattern you can see with laptops. Dell is a little bit funny. They give themselves a credit with recycling, so their total, they say, is actually lower. It depends. Desktops, it's a bit more of a mixed picture, but still production is very predominant across most original equipment manufacturers. And tablets are very production intensive. Basically, the smaller and more complicated the device, the more energy and whatnot is going to be going into manufacturing them. So you're more likely to get releases in production that exceed those that occur during use. I'm relying here very heavily on other people's work. This is not my own. A lot of complicated numbers going on, but if you do the arithmetic, what the results from this study tell you is that using your computer accounts for about 20% of the total energy used over its life, whereas manufacturing is 80% of the energy. So if you want recycling, post-consumer recycling to solve the waste problem, then you are confining yourself to that 20%. This is what industrial electronics recycling looks like. You can see from the machinery there, it's an energy-intensive process. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it or that there aren't benefits to it, but it's not sort of, you put your item in this blue box, magic happens, and then a new product emerges into the world. It's an industrial process itself. And not terribly sophisticated in many cases. This is just a conveyor belt that's leading sort of pre-shredded electronics into a big canister that has chains whipping around at it, a ridiculously high rate and smashing them into smaller pieces. In principle, no more sophisticated than that person that we saw in Dhaka lifting the printer over his head and smashing it on the ground. Of course, the conditions of work are quite different, but in terms of who's doing, sophisticated versus unsophisticated recycling, not really that different. I can't resist telling this one quick anecdote. So one recycling firm that we went into, this is copper at the end of their process. The copper is now ready to be sold back onto the world market, right? So this would be going into electronics or automobiles or anything else that requires copper. They wouldn't tell us who they sold it to. They wouldn't tell us the company name, but they would say that whoever this company is has a contract with the US Department of Defense, which within 24, and stated in their contract is that within 24 hours of a declaration of war, it's a plumbing company, they stop making pipes and they start making bullets. So this probably wound up as munitions zinging around Afghanistan or what have you. So following electronics is this way into just the tangly mess of worldliness that I find so interesting. Okay, sorry, a slight aside there. Again, relying heavily on other people's work here, measures of energy used in different phases of mobile phone life, just pointing out that component manufacturing is where a large chunk of that energy is used up. And in this same paper, they talk about the energy savings that are received by working with recycled materials. So we have very high rates of energy savings, but we have to remember that that's relative to virgin materials or raw material mining. So those very high energy savings are happening in this part, right? Not in component manufacturing. Yet another reason we need to be looking upstream. One more piece of evidence about why we need to look upstream. This is a map of data from the US Environmental Protection Agency from their toxic release inventory data set. And it is chemical releases from what the EPA calls the US computers and electronic industry. We often think about electronics as now an offshore manufacturing process. That is definitely important, but manufacturing still goes on in the US. If you're thinking, wondering about the scale of those very colorful dots, they're a bit hard to see, but the biggest one, that's 11 million pounds of, to give you a sense of the scale. And each color, there's so many chemicals released, there's too many colors to represent. So anyway, and we also, of course, we think of Silicon Valley, which is very important, but it's actually, electronics manufacturing in the US is distributed across quite a wide range of industrial infrastructure across the whole continent. And we miss that. We miss all of that if what electronic waste means is post-consumer discard. So remember, this is toxic release inventory data. This is coming out of manufacturing, but it's within the e-waste storyline, this isn't typically what's talked about. Okay. We've talked about the mining, we've talked about production. Let's talk now a little bit more about use. More and more of us are using our devices in a way that connects us to the so-called cloud, right? Which, listen to the word, it's a light, environmentally benign metaphor, right? But of course, all of that cloud infrastructure, it has to be built, it has to be powered. And if we look at, this is a bit of a cartoonish map of server farms around the world, but people who've tried to do some estimations suggest that data centers account for somewhere between 1% and 2% of total global electricity consumption now, and of course that's increasing. 1% to 2%, it's not a huge amount, but on the other hand, that is devoted to one sort of very specific sector of an economy that is typically framed as digital, ethereal, immaterial. We must remember, of course, that everything has to be built somehow, somewhere, and it has to be powered somehow, somewhere. It's hard to make blanket statements about the environmental consequences of running data centers because it depends, on how the power is generated. But even things like hydroelectric can, depending on the ground conditions, lead to the release of something called methylmercury, which it's a highly potent neurotoxin, and it bioaccumulates, and so will work its way up food chains. But none of that is usually part of the e-waste picture. This was a surprise to me, but roughly 95% of our communications over cell phones and whatnot doesn't actually go through space. It goes through undersea cables. Very tiny proportion is with satellites and whatnot. I'll talk about those in just a minute. But There's something like 470, 480 undersea cables currently in use, totaling about 1 million kilometers, so it would wrap around the Earth about 25 times. And when those cables cease to be either technically functioning or economically functional, they are abandoned in place. So they're just on the bottom of the sea, and we've been putting cables across the ocean for about 160 years. Yet another aspect of electronic discards that we don't typically think about when it comes to thinking about e-waste. Their main, the research into this, the effects of undersea cables is actually pretty new, and a lot of it suggests that they're fairly benign, and they even become or can become habitat for benthic organisms. But there are other people who argue that it might look good from a biodiversity point of view. You get all these amazing corals and wildlife, but what's not clear is this new territory opening up, or is this concentrating what was dispersed wildlife from elsewhere now onto these undersea cables. Last little bit in terms of the discardscapes that we don't typically think of. Now, a minute ago, I said that something like 95% of our communications go through undersea cables, but we're also highly dependent on electronics in orbit in the form of GPS. So GPS on your phone relies on a set of satellites in orbit. Of course, data being fed into our weather reports is being collected through satellites in orbit. And NASA and the European Space Organization have launched whole programs that are concerned with tracking orbital debris, which is what you see here. It's an interesting image. You have to realize that the dots there are nothing like actual size. If you were zooming by in a spaceship, you would not see that. The pieces are typically so tiny that at that sort of level of zoom, you wouldn't be able to see it. So the size of them is hugely exaggerated, but the distribution, you can see the geosynchronous orbit around, and then all of these derelict satellites and whatnot in orbit. NASA's own data indicates that about half of what goes up fails and then just sits in orbit as waste, discard. So we are having an electronic waste footprint even off the planet as well. Okay, I realize I'm going on a bit long, so I just want to close by not just talking about the problem or even problems, but the things that might actually be done that could move the conversation upstream and have consequences, not with post-consumer discard so much, but moving up into manufacturing and design. So I'm going to talk about some conventional and less conventional things that could be done. You know, one thing that we could do is decriminalize export when export is being done for reuse, refurbishment, repair, because the longer you're keeping devices that are already manufactured in use, the longer you are conserving the materials and energy that went into manufacturing them in the first place. The Basel Convention already permits export for reuse, but it unfortunately has a very ambiguous part of it that says reuse can include repair, refurbishment, or upgrading, but not major reassembly. But then it doesn't define what counts as major reassembly. And so critics will say, well, any export is waste, and advocates are having to work against that image of e-waste dumping that is such a strong part of the e-waste storyline. We could facilitate what we might call ethical trade, very similar to how we might think about fair trade coffee or textiles. A little bit of a complicated graphic here, but part of the research that I've been involved with involved businesses on the US side of the border and the Mexico side of the border, and sending high-value, recyclable, repairable, or refurbishable equipment to Mexico for hand disassembly, if it was recycling, which the reason that is important is hand disassembly leads to a much cleaner fraction of material to go into the smelting process, whereas the automated shredding, it's much more, it can be much more mixed. It's harder, it's less pure, so that messes with the smelting of it. But this business where I did research in northern Mexico was also engaged in repairing and then selling to the local market what had been used equipment in the United States. So we could talk about certification systems for ethical trade. They could be done on a contract basis. It doesn't need to be a certification system. Lots that I could talk about there. We could institute genuine, what I would call genuine extended producer responsibility. Those of you who live here, you know in BC, when you go and buy a new electronic device, there's an environmental handling fee tacked onto the purchase price. I can't remember if it's you actually see it on the bill or whether it's you do actually see it. Yeah, okay. So in some jurisdictions you don't see it. It's just wrapped into the total price. But there's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, you can make a good argument that consumers of a particular class of goods should have some direct responsibility for handling their waste at the end of life. But this legislation, not only in BC, but elsewhere, it's framed as extended producer responsibility, and producer is over and over again referred to as the original equipment manufacturers. But of course, by giving us the cost or the price, it's a guarantee that the producers are not, in the language of economics, feeling the price signal, right, that would perhaps incentivize them to design differently. So we would need genuine extended producer responsibility laws to do that, things that would force companies to devote profit to redesigning. Now this is data from, I'm again borrowing heavily from other people's work here, and they were concerned with labor practices in Apple's supply chain. And they did an analysis of the value chain of Apple's products, iPad and iPhone. And you can see the profit rates for Apple in the wide red slices there, and that versus the cost of labor. So until we're instituting producer responsibility that has an effect on those red slices, we're not going to get genuine extended producer responsibility. We'll get extended consumer responsibility, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely not producer responsibility. Second to last slide. We could democratize industry. That sounds very maybe odd or strange. When I talk about this point, I like to think about this phrase that's attributed to this heterodox economist. Is it Arthur Bolding? I think Bolding is the last name. If it exists, it is possible. If it exists, it is possible. So if you think about institutions like the US FDA or Health Canada, you and I can go into a store, purchase our food and pharmaceuticals without giving too much thought as to whether they're safe to consume or not. Those institutions didn't always exist. In fact, the FDA largely came out of the thalidomide crisis in the 60s, or as some of its regulations came out of that. And Europe didn't have similar institutions and was hit much harder by that crisis. But my point here is that if democratizing industry sounds kind of unusual, it's to understand that there is already public oversight of industry in many ways. So to insist on, organize for public oversight of the electronics industry is not to do anything unusual in that sense. We already have institutions that do that. The other thing that's important about these already existing examples is, when you think about it, is that they are, of course there are all kinds of flaws with it. Companies get around rules and regulations, we know that. But at least 3 multi-billion-dollar industries, food, pharmaceuticals, and automobile industry, have to demonstrate that the products that they are going to put on the market are safe within margins of legislated risk before they manufacture them and sell them. Now, if it can be done in those multi-billion-dollar industries, there's nothing that would then make that impossible to bring to another multi-billion-dollar industry, the electronics industry, where that public oversight insisted on, non or less toxic materials, insisted on durability, insisted on repairability. We already have these kinds of things. The reason I have the National Highway Traffic Administration up there is, none of us would, even if we wanted to, be able to go out and buy a car and drive it legally if it didn't have seatbelts or tempered glass. But it wasn't that long ago when manufacturers didn't have to include those. And the only reason they do is because of organized consumer action, which eventually led to the formation of the National Transportation and Highway Administration. So RoHS and REACH, these are 2 examples of existing legislation in Europe which have actually begun to affect upstream electronics manufacturing. So if it can be done, RoHS is reduction of hazardous substance, REACH is something similar, except it cuts across all industries, not just electronics. And the EU is mandating what can and cannot be used in manufactured products. So again, if they can do it, why can't we? Okay, last point. I think sort of an ultimate takeaway here is that until we can reduce the aggregate material and energy throughput of electronics manufacturing, we will not be mitigating the e-waste problem. So there's, within ecological economics, some of you may be familiar with this, the so-called Jevons paradox. William Stanley Jevons, a 19th century political economist who studied the coal industry. And he noticed this sort of paradoxical pattern where as coal use became more and more efficient, the demand for coal went up rather than down. Because as you needed less coal to do the same amount of work, it meant there was more coal on the market, which meant people who were already using coal could use more to do more work, or people or industries that didn't use coal at all could now afford to do so. So even though you had per unit of work efficiency gains that would reduce demand, you had aggregate increases in demand. So we need to talk about what some people have called degrowth. And that's a giant set of literature that I'm summarizing in a single slide. The degrow discourse has no blueprint, no plan for how to actually achieve it. But one thing that it does talk about is shifting from efficiency to sufficiency. One of the reasons that's important, at least when it comes to the toxicological consequences of things like electronic waste, is even if we manage to do sort of stationary state or less of the same, so same of the same or less of the same, some toxicological components that come out of e-waste will continue to accumulate in the biosphere even if we're just producing them at a constant rate. They will continue because they're effectively permanent. They don't break down. So until we're actually reducing aggregate demand for energy and materials, we're not going to reduce overall waste in the aggregate across the economy or with electronics specifically. Okay, you have been very patient and let me go on for quite a long time. So we still have time for questions or discussion, and I'm happy to talk further about anything that I covered today. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for this. This is really great. I just wanted to pick up on two sort of aspects of the discourse on e-waste that you brought into question focus on the downstream impacts, and then also this focus on the dematerialization of the internet.
Yeah.
You know, this, and that both of these are essential to maintaining a growth economy. Because you need, in order to have any kind of logical consistency to the idea of growth, you have to have the idea of a dematerialized
Right.
virtual economy,
Right.
light, unimpactful. And also, if you address disposability, then you're basically cutting off the lifeblood of capital by
Right.
So yeah, I was happy that you ended with the idea of degrowth, but you know, obviously the impetus behind growth is the accumulation of capital, and it's, you know, class struggle.
Right.
So I sort of wonder whether that, like, this literature on degrowth, is it kind of glossing over the power dynamics there, like who is accumulating capital, and also just sort of interestingly the parallel between the accumulation of waste and the accumulation of capital, because when you concentrate wealth, it becomes a form of toxicity in itself. So there's kind of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the degrowth literature, first of all, it's pretty sprawling, and so certainly, you know, there's a clear awareness that power needs to be talked about, class needs to be, you know, and that, you know, degrowth is in, I'm trying to avoid the word in essence, but anyway, something other than capitalism. You're not going to get a degrowth capitalism. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that is part of the implication, I think. A broader implication of talking about waste or discard studies is, you know, my specific stuff is around electronics, but I'm actually talking about capitalism. Yeah. Yeah. And for me, you know, it's way harder for me to wrap my head around this sort of monolithic monster called capitalism, but I can understand the electronics industry. Yeah. So it's a way in, for me, it's a way into those broader conversations. Yeah.
And I guess, is there a choice to avoid using the term capital or talking about accumulation, because it can be kind of, it can turn people off?
Well, it's one reason that I find the degrowth literature useful is because at least it doesn't start with that kind of blockage of, oh, you're just an anti-capitalist, right? So I'm not even going to listen, right? So degrowth, it does offer a way to at least open up conversations. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you looked into the innovations that Dell and HP are bringing to design? So essentially creating innovative engineering designs in their equipment to reduce that
Right.
that manufacturing footprint, as you say, the big glut,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
help reduce the intrinsic inputs.
Not in any depth. I mean, I know there are two companies which are devoting a lot of time to that. Dell, as what I do know about it, has for a long time been very keen to, they want to do closed loop manufacturing, and Apple, of course, most recently has said, we're going to do this without mining, right? Eventually, so they claim. But I sort of goes back to the point you're making, is that the closed, it's a nice image, the closed loop, but the closed loop can't stay this big and also be capitalism. It has to be doing this, right? And the Apple example specifically, you know, if they do ever achieve that goal of not using any mined materials, that may be great for Apple in a certain way, certainly from a marketing perspective. But if they exit the market for those mined materials, those same materials now become available for all those buyers who couldn't pay Apple's prices. So aggregate demand goes up. So hence, I think, your point, which is to be talking about all of those things, you can't avoid the sort of fundamental contradictions of capital, which are dependent on growth. Yeah.
I actually had an opportunity to discuss with one of the key people at Dell how the program was working. So essentially what they're doing is they're designing better attachment mechanisms that allow defabrication of their units.
Yep.
And as you say, the closed loop.
Yeah.
And rather than them looking at that being a cost savings, they're looking at it as helping the environment.
Right.
So I asked them, I said, well, if they have to be marketing that to masses,
Right.
to buy their electronics, and are they seeing a market advantage because of it? Is society valuing that innovation?
Yeah.
And their answer is absolutely not.
And I wonder, is that well, you know, I guess I could think of a number of reasons for that, but part of it would be if and how the price signal to consumers is communicated. I have no idea how, say, an HP printer compares to a Canon printer in terms of price, but if it's only a few dollars difference, then unless there's something on the HP thing that is saying, you know, yes, we're a little bit more, but, you know, this was half the energy that Canon over there beside us used, you know, so you should purchase us. Yeah.
Yeah, it's consumer driven a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess my point is that the message isn't getting across to the common masses that are
Right.
driving the demand, which is driving it.
Right.
We all have great ideas and concepts for trying to keep
Yeah.
the waste down, but
Yeah.
until they get the message to the consumer.
Yeah. Yeah, though I mean, a sort of counterpoint to that is, of course, is Steve Jobs' old slogan that the consumer's job is not to know what they want. That's our job, right? So whether it's consumer demand or manufacturer push, I think, you know, we'll go back and forth on that all the time. Yeah. Other questions or, yeah?
I was curious about what you said at the beginning, about how we tend to overestimate how much flow there is between non-Annex 7 countries and use. I think I wrote down in my notes the wrong number. I wrote down, you said only 1% of the global use is going to non-Annex 7 countries?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Well, that's extremely low.
It is.
So, I was just curious, you probably also mentioned this at the beginning too, and I missed it. Does this figure include illegal? Like, is there any way to quantify how much is not being formally reported?
Right. So that's a great question, and it's something that anyone interested in international trade data, regardless if it's electronic waste or wheat, needs to contend with, because unrecorded, misrecorded trade is, you know, by definition, it's not going to be in the data set. So there's an anthropologist named Carolyn Nordstrom has this amazing book called Global Outlaws, and she did an ethnography of global trade where she spent time on cargo ships, you know, as they crossed oceans, did work at ports and whatnot, and has also done, well, that's sort of beside the point. Anyway, her estimates, she was willing to claim that in some ports, up to 90% of what gets offloaded from a ship goes unrecorded, but that's across everything, right? So now where that becomes important is that, and that the 1% figure that you see up there, some of the figures, for example, for Agbogbloshie in Ghana, which literally state, you know, hundreds of millions of tons of e-waste arrive from overseas to this location, which sounds like a lot, and of course it is. And when you look at the data that is available for just the number of shipping containers that go in and out of the country, not what's in them, but just the number of containers. So Carolyn Nordstrom, her high-end estimate is 90% goes unrecorded. You would have to have 400% unrecorded data in Ghana to account for that figure of hundreds of millions of tons, which makes that figure, to me, very unlikely. All right. Yeah. Yeah. But it is a super tricky issue that you're drawing attention to. Yeah. Yeah.
There's just something I'm curious, is that it was interesting to hear about the upstream and it's needed and based on your research. And you kind of touched on a couple of things that made me curious about, because you're talking more about like mining and manufacturing and needing to pay more attention to it. What about, I can't stop thinking about military industrial complex, because that's like probably the biggest industry that makes biggest waste.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how much discussion is around those kind of discussions around.
So the military specifically as a source of electronic waste? Yeah, there is some discussion. Actually, it's quite interesting. In I want to say 2008, there was a big kerfuffle in the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee when counterfeit and used components that were coming out of China and making their way into the defense or weapons manufacturing supply chains for the U.S. military. And the reason I say it's interesting is there, at least publicly, there was this theater of, sort of shock about what? Our manufacturing is in China? Our supply chains for our weapons are, and these are, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, pick your poison, L3 Technologies. They're global companies, and their supply chains, shockingly, are not within the United States. They've been globalized like everything else. So there is some discussion. I don't think I've really seen anything that has tried to quantify the military as a specific segment of the waste stream. Yeah, well, it can be surprising. There's a geographer named Trevor Paglen does some really interesting work where he does use publicly disclosed data from the defense industry on waste from one of his projects was about the stealth fighter and the sort of contradiction about this super secret weapon system, and yet data was being released about the amount of waste that was coming out of the facilities that were manufacturing it. And so you could sort of reverse engineer the volume of the manufacturing that was going on. He talks about blank spots on the map, and while you might not be able to see the secrecy itself, you can see the outlines, and so the outlines give you a sense of its scale. So
I think he actually touched on all those facilities that collect data.
yes, yeah,
Surveillance.
yeah.
So often using access to information.
Yeah, or he's done some really interesting projects tracking secret rendition flights for enhanced interrogation or torture, depending on the terms you want to use, where in this very ironic way, the tail numbers of planes, even though they're secret flights, they still have to be registered within the FAA database. And so you get these weird flights that start in the middle of Nevada and land in the middle of Afghanistan, and then you can start tracking that tail number all around the world from publicly available data, even though it's a secret flight. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
About the role of artists and cultural producers, and your analysis of charismatic images that we got a bit more into it last night at the reading. But so charismatic images like those circulated by Greenpeace band. So one of the major components of your work around e-waste is to get us to reconsider what waste even is, our basic assumptions, and which is something artists do often to represent the world, make it unfamiliar. And so there are these charismatic images, like these mind bombs, that, to use the Greenpeace term, of people and places in Guayú, in Ghana, And these images have done a lot of heavy lifting in terms of getting people to even know about this, right? And we talked about it a little bit yesterday, how it's kind of ironic that, like you said yourself, got into it you got into this field of research because of like the Ban report.
Yeah, because of that Ban report. That's
yeah.
right. Yeah.
And a lot of the so like I guess my question is, as artists, we often I'm speaking for some of us in the room. We deal with the power of images, and especially if you're, and probably when you're making an argument, there are certain kind of shortcuts you take to get people's attention.
Sure.
Do you have any, like, how do you grapple with that? Do you have any advice, or how do you make strong arguments? Sometimes in making a strong argument or trying to grab attention to something that's totally off people's radar, you have to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in this case, it's. I would never want to speak for artists because I am not one, but I think.
Well, I mean, you can relate it in terms of you're an academic, you make arguments.
Right.
Sometimes make stronger arguments, just
Well,
just
right.
Make
I
a
mean,
point.
I think the reason that I've become much more adamant about trying to reassemble the conversation about electronic waste is really coming to grips with that point that Max is making here. And not just Max. Samantha McBride has a great book called Recycling Reconsidered. She's a director at the New York City Department of Sanitation. And she's made these kinds of points as well. That once I became cognizant that what had fired me up about the Ban image was, wow, that's awful and it's terrible, but it's also this 3% part of the problem. And so I needed somehow then to more accurately portray the overall picture. How you do that, I don't know. I mean, I think this is one reason that art and artists are so important, is to think through those image politics. I mean, the mind bomb approach is one approach, but as we see it has, like other weapons do, like I say in the chapter, it has, like other bombs, it has collateral damage, which is to focus our attention downstream and leave basically invisible all of this other stuff. Even as the Exporting Harm report itself is saying, look, recycling is not the end goal here. I mean, we need to do it, but the most important thing is clean production. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, and I have no idea artistically how you would get at this, but that's supposed to be what artists are good at, or figuring that out. Yeah.
So I want to come back to capital, right?
Maybe we can close the door there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the notion of worlding, right?
Yeah.
Which I think does really good work for the project and the argument. I mean, so to what extent then is hiding, right? To what extent is worlding equivalent to ideology or fetishization in this kind of veiling, hiding away with the commodity literature, right?
Yeah.
So then that gets to the question, so who are the agents in the worlding?
Yeah.
Which you kind of answered, that was one of my first questions, and then you talk about, there's the academics, there's policymakers, there's, and then I think you also mentioned in the worlding is the objects, right? So there's an agency with the objects, so that's kind of a Latourian move, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Josh and I went to grad school, so we read Latour together.
Yes.
So then, so what is the relationship? So there's lots of actors in worlding.
Yeah.
Whereas degrowth, like, what is the relationship between worlding and degrowth?
Okay.
Can you connect those two?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I mean, a certain glib answer is anything is going to be a worlding, right? Representation, I suppose, is another way of saying that. In order to make sense of the world, unavoidably, you're going to presence some things and absent others. I make this move elsewhere in the book where I talk about what the Basel Action Network is doing in their report. As it's not at all scandalous. Imagine if you had some sort of panoptic camera that could take a picture of everything, including the camera itself, and you presented that picture as evidence of something. How would a viewer know what it's evidence of, since nothing is missing and everything is there? So it's not just fetishization or the commodity fetish and that kind of stuff. Any method is going to world in some ways and not others. So part of the discussion that I do elsewhere in the book, I talk about the politics of measurement as a form of worlding, and which may sound very abstract, but has a concrete implication. So a lot of the policy making around e-waste is premised on measures of weight, just straight up kilograms or pounds. But weight, tells us nothing about toxicity. You can have a kilogram of aluminum and a kilogram of mercury. They are ontologically, they're identical in terms of weight, but toxicologically, they're ontologically radically different. There's no outside adjudicator to go to that you can, sort of kneel down and say, which is the right measure to use? Which is the best measure to use? Inevitably, when we're doing research or representation, we're forced to make choices, and those choices inevitably world in some ways and not others.
So degrowth then would require a sort of a re-worlding?
Yeah, it is a...
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would
Yeah.
Because you got the R word cropping up, right, in terms of revolution,
Right.
or like what is going to shift? Because crucially, this slide's really important. Much of what has been hidden is the 98%, whatever.
Yeah.
But for things to change, and this might be argument, manufacturing is key.
Right. Yeah.
And so for the manufacturing to change, there's going to have to be another kind of revolution, perhaps not an anti-capitalist overthrow of capitalism.
Yeah.
That's one way to go, but
Right.
perhaps more of a material revolution where be a shift of how energy data is produced, consumed. Away
Maybe.
from heat. It's got to be a beyond electronic.
Right.
For this to die down a bit or shift, because maybe talk more about it, Josh. But MIT, there's studies on protein transfer for data, right?
Right.
Microchips.
Yeah.
So the actual materials have to shift for there to be a real shift there. I think.
Yeah. I mean, I have no technical understanding of those sorts of changes that seem to be coming to what we now understand as electronics. But then I guess the question, it remains is, does that shift to, say, quantum computing and different materials, does it then end up having very large proportionate consequences for the generation of discards? Because sort of no matter what the process, it seems to me there's always discard of some sort or another. It may end up being, and I'm using the word discard to avoid the sort of the baggage that comes with the word waste. Discards may be benign. They might be.
Yeah, well, maybe in the future there'll be wooden computers.
Maybe.
Something like where the actual material, instead of plastic cups or so much plastic, we've shifted to paper. But maybe the actual material's got to shift. I think.
Certainly materials, how they work, their own agencies are a very important part of this. Yeah, absolutely.
There's at the end of another scholar, Jennifer Gabrys, which I'm sure you know of, another e-waste scholar. At the end of her book, mentions research that's being done into electronics, figuring out how electronics can be made of materials that will then sprout.
Right. Yeah. Well,
or help to sprout.
There is some. There's
compost.
There's so-called biodegradable plastics and whatnot, and Max would be much better at talking about this than I would. But those degradable, as I understand it, many of those degradable plastics, they degrade in the sense they disappear from being visually there, but but chemically they're still present. It's just that the pieces are so tiny that it's sort of at the molecular level as opposed to, a bag. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess just sort of following from his point there, I was just thinking about this, that, as a way of describing what representation does, the worlding term removes questions of power. Like, you're not looking at whether what is rendered invisible is serving, the maintenance of existing structures of power. Similarly, like quantification as a way of knowing is already moving things in the direction of commodification and manipulation. That, once just that of, the tendency to use charts and numbers, there's always that risk of already, eliminating all of those relational ties that the thing has.
Yeah.
And it's particularity as mercury, or I look at water, so I look a lot at virtual water flow calculations, which are very similar. Once you quantify, well, there was this much water used in a pound of coffee production. We've lost whether that coffee was grown in a monocrop plantation doused with pesticides, or was it grown in a shade system with high biodiversity.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that worlding gets rid of power. I mean, some of the people that I would draw on to back that concept up would say that, power is what results from associating together what they might call resources, not necessarily in the sense of mining resources or even water, but in order to obtain durable influence. And so the issue is tracing the action that allows worlding to manifest, as it were. Yeah. I did not do a power analysis in this presentation, that's true, but I don't think there's anything in the literature that sort of articulates this notion of worlding that would make power absent or invisible. But instead of power being there as something that can do the explaining for you, the job is to explain power. How does this or that institution, organization, individual obtain durable influence? What has to be associated together for that to happen? And part of the answer that this literature, that Paul's partly pointing to, some parts of the STS literature would talk about all of, or be keen to point out all of the non-human agencies going on that have to be present or made present such that power or durable influence results. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about these kinds of materials to me, the metals, the plastics, is the durability. And it's interesting to me the shift from, systems of domination that were primarily tied to things like gold and silver, and then you move into petrochemicals. They're still durable, unearthed materials, but the durability is unintended and unwanted.
Right.
Because the thing that we love hydrocarbons for is the speed and the acceleration, and then the sort of toxic leftover is, that lasts for millennia is unwanted.
Right.
But the metals have always been valued for their durability. So when these very durable things, whether it's a metal or a hydrocarbon, get launched into these accelerated turnover cycles of disposability, then you get this accumulation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the whole graphic, because it's industrial waste that dominates, right? It's supposed to E. It's still industrial. It's framing the.
That's right.
The massive. It's a powerful.
Yeah.
Have you received any resistance, Josh, from you presented to industry people, or
I haven't.
I mean, there is a sharp critique. You're hiding this. This
right.
Is, we know this is a problem. I mean, there is a sharp kind of parallel critique.
Yeah. I have presented it at a couple of industry things now, but it was recycling industry and then repair industry. So, yeah, I probably the choir in a certain sense. Yeah.
If the definition of like toxicity changes, I'm just thinking of this research by Paul Stamets where he takes mycelium, like mushroom, oyster mushroom, and uses it to like break down, I think it's cadmium or petroleum byproduct. Like if we like can master or like change the definition of toxicity, does that, I'm just wondering like how that fits in. Is that just an increase in efficiency, or is it, would that be like an idea of degrowth?
I don't know that that would necessarily be about degrowth. That might be more, well, first of all, I will have to admit I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, I get it. I get the idea of using, you know, biological processes to break down materials that are or can be toxic. I get that. Whether that would that be degrowth? Not in the sense of you know, necessarily reducing aggregate demand for materials and energy. It may be a way of kicking the contradictions of capital a little bit further down the timeline. Yeah.
And in a post-capitalist future, we have a big mess to clean up in the mushrooms.
Well, this is right. I mean, this, yeah, this is part of some of the ideas that Max and I have written about with a graduate student, where, you know, we sort of essentially said, you know, even if you could shut the switches off today, you've still got thousands of years of having to deal with this stuff of various kinds. And it's not, I mean, nuclear waste is the one that gets held up as the iconographic example of that, but the charismatic image, that's right. But plastics, you know, what we think of as very mundane materials. Plastics are like that. Endocrine disruptors, which are part of that. These two have, you know, lifetimes that easily meet or exceed nuclear waste, which is usually called, you know, talked about as a special waste, as if it's kind of an anomaly. But a lot of other very mundane materials are similar in that sense, the timescales. Yeah. Yeah.
One final comment.
Sure.
Remind me, Josh, a bit Charles Dickens' novels of stuff, particularly Bleak House, and
Okay.
where you kind of get this revealing of the connections, the world within London,
Okay.
the kind of people going on the trash dumps.
Yeah.
With that recycling, but there's all these alternative economies that Dickens
Right.
shows is at work in London.
Okay.
And it's
Yeah.
kind of like a little parallel with the, we assume that it's the receiver of waste, that's it.
Yeah.
But actually there's this whole
Right.
multiple economies at work.
Yeah, I mean, something I didn't talk about at all is the typical way of framing the stories about e-waste is a very, you know, some people talk about bourgeois environmentalism. You know, it's a very classed, to look at those apparent conditions in the photographs of, say, Agbogbloshie and Guyot. There's an implicit subject position that's being addressed in those photographs, right? That I can't imagine how horrible. Well, yeah, you can't, because you're a middle-class white guy who lives in Canada. You know, that experience is not your experience. What are the other options available? You know, these sorts of questions, which can be tricky, because even to make that point, as some people at BAN have, they said, well, you're being an apologist, you're being a denier, you know, so... Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, but I take your point. Yeah, for sure. Cool. school. You guys have been here a long time. Do you want to go?
Yeah, you did great too.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thanks for showing up. Thank you.